Yeah, I'm just messaging Fiona now, saying we're on our way.
I think we're good to start.
Okay, a warm welcome to everyone to this NPC webinar on climate change and the state of nature. My name is Fazile Harvey. I'm Head of Policy at Disability Rights UK, and it's a real pleasure to host and chair this event. I've got to come clean with you all. I'm a screen reader user because I'm blind, so I really apologise if you hear a weird automated voice. It talks to me, and of course, because I only take in things through my ears, I don't really engage with chat, but Naomi and the team at NPC will engage with the chat. So let me just start with some basic information about transparency and access and communication. So transparency, we are recording the meeting, and there may be journalists present, so just so you all know that. In terms of communication, there are BSL interpreters and they'll be spotlighted, and there is also captioning if you need it. Now, if you need any help on the technical side, please make that clear in the chat. And also, Naomi and colleagues will be collecting up questions in the chat. I mean, while I'm speaking, I'd be really grateful if you don't chat, just so that my screen reader doesn't talk to me. That would be really, really helpful. But the minute I'm not speaking, you can absolutely chat as much as you like. Can I just give you a sense of why this meeting's so important? So obviously you all know that there isn't a day when climate emergency or state of nature emergency aren't in the news these days, with lots of announcements rowing back by government, but actually industry saying we're moving forward on moving to better sources of energy. So lots and lots of discussion. This issue is with us now. It's not a future issue anymore. It's with us now. And that's why this project that NPC is leading is so important, because we need to put our voices into the mix and our experiences into the mix now. The project has been looking at how to raise the issues that disabled people, older people, Black and minority ethnic groups, younger people, the particular issues we all face in terms of the climate emergency and nature emergency, so that we can have our space at the table. And NPC have already done some great work with 60 organisations, actually really interrogating how are these groups affected differently by climate change. And findings have been produced, and we're going to share some of that with you today. But also NPC wants to take the next step now, which is to really think about what do organisations need to really embed work on climate change and the nature emergency into their work, into their business plans, into their priorities, into their strategies, because we actually all need to think about the people we serve and how they need to benefit from whatever change is going to go on. So this meeting's at a really crucial point. So we'll hear how it will be structured is we'll hear something about the work that's already been done and the findings. And then we'll move into a sort of second part of the meeting where you'll all have the opportunity to think about what next and what do organisations need in terms of moving forward on this issue. So that gives you an idea of the 1.5 hours we're going to spend together. We'll hear from some speakers, we'll stop regularly to take questions, and then the last sort of third of the meeting will be about what steps you think is where you should be taken, what steps should be taken to really help charities embed this in their work. I mean, coming back to why I think this is so important for all of us, as I mentioned earlier, I'm blind, and I'm really struck by the digital and information revolution that's taken place over the last 20 years. You know, before, you know, the 1990s, I couldn't have used a screen reader on a computer. In 2007, with the Apple iPhone, they managed to make a flat screen accessible to blind people. We've had legislation in America around making sure devices are accessible, and that has influenced Microsoft and Apple. I'm not saying everything's fantastic in the world of the web, it isn't, but I think it does show you that by disabled people and older people arguing for their rights and their equality early on in the process, things are a lot better than they would have been. And I certainly feel as a blind person that my access to information, it's not perfect by any means, but it's improved 1,000-fold. And I think now we're witnessing another revolution that's really going to affect the environment as opposed to information. And we need to put the same effort in as disabled people, older people, young people, Black and minority ethnic people, in making sure that revolution works for us. And it's a lot easier to be on the ground floor than retrofit when things are already in place. So I think it's about how do we make sure that the way smart homes develop and that technology and that kind of the new heating systems and the way we use electronic appliances, how do we make sure that those things happen in a way that really benefit us all? How do we make sure that transport changes, whether it's a private car or electric buses or new railways? How do we make sure those transport changes benefit us all? And in terms of the environment, the open space, the urban space, the quality of air, you know, what do we need to do now to make sure that we all benefit? Because these are all issues that are really affecting the poorest people in our communities. And there's a lot of overlap between poverty and systemic inequality on race, on disability, on age. So I think it's really important we're in on the ground floor. And I commend NPC for putting our voices centre stage, because we're so often overlooked and so often we come to the party late. But we really need to be at the party now and influencing the shape of whatever happens on air, on heating, on transport, on smart homes. We need to be there and making sure that actually new policies, new services, new funding is built around our needs. So we're going to hear first from a campaigner who's done a lot on this to get disabled people's needs on that ground floor, Dr. Emma Geen. And Emma's done some great work on developing the first sort of community climate change plan for disabled people. She's well recognised and has been involved in the Include and Adapt project. And she's also was involved in an exchange last year run by the US Embassy, which was around climate change. before I just hand over to Emma, could I just thank City Bridge Foundation and William Grant Foundation for making this work possible and making our conversation today possible. Emma, I'm going to hand over to you now. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you very much for having me. I think my slides should be coming up. Brill. Thank you. Yes, so the photo here is of some sofas and tables and chairs in a street next to a sign that says "Welcome to the Garden." And I thought I'd started with this photo because we were doing this project in the middle of in between all of the lockdowns, and we were kind of desperately trying to find ways to find where disabled people were meeting. So we took this sofa around the city and put it in different places. But yeah, I've been going to be talking about our Community Climate Action Plan by and for disabled people. Could I have the next slide, please? Yeah, so I thought I'd start a little bit with some general context. So it's kind of both a point of pride and horror that our Community Climate Action Plan by and for disabled people was the first in the world of that type, in the sense that obviously pleased to be kind of breaking some ground in the space, but also, you know, in 2002 when we published this, you know, we should have already been way more ahead on this work. And you know, just there should be, I think, a community climate action plan by and for disabled people in every country and city of the world. So we did ours in Bristol, in South England, and as kind of I was saying, like there's lots of problems around disabled people being excluded from this work, which is problem both in terms of disabled people being one of the most vulnerable communities to climate disasters, where, you know, between 2 and 4 times more likely to sort of die or be injured during extreme weather from climate change. But we can also have new barriers created for us by climate action when we're not included in how it's created. And this photo on this slide shows us protesting outside of our city hall on how the clean air zone was being implemented in Bristol and how that was going to kind of impact upon disabled people. And obviously it's really bad in terms of the impact it can have on us, but I think also it's really important to think about for the climate movement itself as well, in terms of what they're missing out on by not including us. So just for starters, we're the biggest minority group. Some stats put up 24% of the population. So you can't have a climate friendly world without us. We can't have those changes being made to our society if 24% of the population can't take part because it's inaccessible. And I think also disabled people, we're experts in sort of adapting and creative problem solving. And I think we can be bringing huge skills to all these changes that are happening. And lastly, just to say, I think also it is very important for disabled people, not just in terms of really making sure that we're part of this, but I think there's a huge opportunity there, in that this is, I think, probably the biggest chance that we're going to have to make society accessible within our time, in terms of the changes that are going to have to be made to society to adapt to climate change are going to be huge, and there's going to be a huge amount of money put into them. And if we can be part of that change, we can be making society accessible at the same time. Can I be going on to the next slide, please? Yeah, so a little bit of context about the project. It was held within a broader project that's being run by Bristol Green Capital Partnership, which was basically supporting 6 disadvantaged communities from across the city of Bristol to make their own community climate action plans. And this was done as part of the Bristol Disability Equality Forum. But I just want to flag that I've now left the organisation because unfortunate problems with its governance. But hoping to continue this work in one way or other. And the photo shows the team of all the people involved in that project doing silly faces. Can we go on to the next slide? Yes, so what did we do? This was a co-produced project, which means that basically we're working with the community to work out how we do this together. So like staff were obviously doing a lot of the kind of hours of organisation and kind of writing up reports. We were trying to really make sure that what was going into that report was led by disabled people from across the city. So we had a steering group which kind of had a really a big steer on kind of what went into that plan and what, you know, taking everyone's ideas and thinking about how we turn that into sort of some kind of action. We obviously drew a lot on the input on thoughts of our members of the charity. We were also basically asking any disabled person in Bristol who was interested in taking part, and we did quite a lot of outreach to try and reach as many of those people as possible. I think particularly because it was kind of during that kind of lockdown period, we were trying lots of different things to try and reach as many different people as possible. But I thought I'd just quickly mention the survey, which I think was kind of the most important in many ways, because you could reach so many people with it, kind of both asking about what people's concerns are and kind of what their biggest worries about climate change and how things are being changed because of climate action were, but also kind of asking for ideas of what we could be doing. And then the other important part of the outreach, I think, was what we called sharing sessions. So because disabled people have been excluded from this work for so long, kind of coming in as sort of some of the first people looking at kind of those changes of society around climate change, and then thinking how can they be accessible. It was quite hard for us to kind of think of what we could do because there weren't other projects that we could draw on and say, oh, we could do this too. So our solution to that was basically have what we call these sharing sessions, where we get subject experts, so like all the people who work in areas like energy and transport or food, to kind of come together with disabled people and sort of say, you know, what are the problems in this area, what are the current solutions, and how could we be doing different things around that would actually work for disabled people. And this slide shows us having a picnic, and there's some disabled people and some food experts, and we were talking about food and like how can we be making kind of food that's good for the planet and disabled people. And then so we used all of those ideas to create our plan, which had the project I think was originally designed to basically saying, oh, what is the community going to do? But it was pretty clear that in a sense, while it's really important that we take actions as communities, and we had some I think important ideas about what we could do as the community of disabled people, obviously some of the huge things has to be done by the broader city itself. So we had kind of split those down the middle, because I think that like say lots of the problems were like, for example, if we want disabled people to be able to travel in ways that are better for the planet, then we might need like more public toilets or better pavements. And obviously those are things that were like way beyond our reach as individual disabled people or charities. So kind of there became a huge role within that, I think, for just kind of lobbying local politicians and making sure that everyone was thinking about our needs within how they were doing the broader climate work. Moving on to the next slide. So yeah, thinking about how charities can help us, I think that idea of co-production, of working with disabled people to create this work, is really essential. Also, you come back to the kind of maximum of sort of nothing about us without us. Make sure that you always have disabled people in the room when you're planning this work, right from the very beginning to the very end, because I think there's always this problem of if you something that's created for us, but we're only included once you start to roll it out, there's going to be problems. And think of us as actors as well as a vulnerable group. I think often disabled people were just kind of pigeonholed as victims or people who were just there to be saved, but actually we have a huge amount of kind of skills and knowledge and wealth that, you know, rest of society might not have in the same that we have, or kind of insights. Or I've been thinking a lot lately about kind of disabled joy, like that ability to look at difficulties and kind of move through all those sort of difficult emotions to like a place of joy within it, and how that kind of relates to the kind of climate anxiety and climate joy. And also, yes, create projects designed for us. I think an awful lot of the conversations that we had with what I was calling those sharing sessions, a lot of disabled people, I sensed some frustration of going, oh, you know, we shared all these insights with these people and they found that very interesting, but what are they then going to go on and do? So I think there's definitely an appetite for all of these organizations who work in climate action to start thinking, okay, now you're going to create something for us. Like, I think obviously the movement needs to do a lot more in general for all marginalized groups, but I think particularly disabled people are feeling very left out by that. Like, I think I certainly get frustrated about the number of sort of EDI panels I've been to on climate change, or just talks about climate change, and you know, disabled people are never on that on that platform with kind of the other groups that are invited there or never talked about. So just making sure that we're very much being kept in this space. Sorry, and the photo on this slide is just one of the presentations I did to a group of disabled people. We go on to the last slide. So that's all I'll say for now, just because I could go on forever and there's not a huge amount of time. Yeah, I'll put the link to the plan in the chat so you can have a read of it yourself. There's a BSL and a easy read version, as well as the plain English one. Also, you might want to look at, we created a guide for protest movements about how to make their protests accessible, which might be useful for some of you as well. And I've also put my email on there just in case anybody felt it would be useful to reach out. And sorry, and this is a photo with me and some other people who went to America with all of the flags of the world behind us. But yeah, thank you very much for the time to chat, and I'm looking forward to hearing what the report has found.
Oh, thank you so much, Emma. That was really inspiring, and I hope everyone in the virtual room got a sense that we can all do something, whether, you know, it's not for all of us to go to the UN and talk on international stages. It may not be all of us who want to campaign at national level, but we can all do things at local level with our groups. And I think Emma's example of actually starting the conversation, involving people, doing something concrete in terms of the local community plan, has given you all some ideas immediately about where your organisation might position itself. Any questions to Emma, Naomi, that are coming through? Please, please raise them.
No questions for now. We'll come back to questions after we've heard from Meryl and Dan, but there's a lot of people saying that was incredibly inspiring and fantastically interesting to hear about. So echoing what you've just said, Fazile.
Yeah, no, I'm a big fan of Emma, so thank you, Emma, for kicking us off to such a good start and getting people thinking about what their organisations can do. We're now going to tell you about the findings from NPC's work as they relate to older people and disabled people. And we're going to kick off with Meryl Davies, who's the Chief Executive of Re-engage, which is an organisation focused on combating isolation and loneliness for older people. And Meryl's going to tell us about the findings as they relate to older people. Meryl, the stage is yours and you've got 10 minutes.
Great, thank you so much, and thank you too to Emma, because that was truly inspirational. So yes, my name is Meryl Davies, and I am for one more day Chief Executive at Re-engage, and it's been a real pleasure to be working with NPC and with Disability Rights UK on this strand of the project. We've been carrying out so at Re-engage we work with people who are over 75 and who are experiencing social isolation and loneliness. So people who are very alone and have very little by way of support networks. And as part of the Everyone's Environment project, we also worked with U3A, and Harriet from U3A is on the call today, and to reach a broader spectrum of older people. So we spoke to 21 older people, all aged over 65. We had 3 focus groups that were absolutely oh yes, please, thank you. Next slide, please. We had these 3 focus groups and also 7 one-to-one calls where we talked directly with groups of older people about the impacts of climate and nature crises, specifically on their lives, and also what they wanted both policymakers and charities to do about their experiences. We found people who are extremely engaged and extremely concerned about the climate and nature crises, and certainly the people that we spoke to were not at all interested in anything being watered down or reduced in any way. They wanted to see greater speed and more action. We also carried out our own piece of research at Re-engage, where 3 times a year we go out to the thousands of older people we work with a specific series of questions. And to coincide with the Everyone's Environment project, we sent out questionnaires about environmental issues, and the average age of the people responding to that was 85. And they wrote to us, making very clear how they are aware of climate change and the impact it's having on them. And one of the things that we were asking people is, what would you like charities to do to support you and help you raise your voice around the climate crisis? So there were 3 points that really came out of this research with older people. One was about providing education and advice on issues related to climate and nature. So they've really felt that it's important for people to understand what is going on and also what they can do about it. And there was a lot of concern about financial implications of having to repair your home after a flood, and information about overheating buildings and having to go into hospitals that were too hot, or having to get to healthcare settings through conditions which have been brought about by the climate crisis. The second thing they asked charities to do was to campaign and to influence government, and to do this alongside and on behalf of older people. And they were very clear that they wanted to see campaigning and influencing, and that their voices are very important, that this isn't an issue which is for the young people to campaign on. This is an issue for everybody to campaign on, and their voice needs to be heard because they've got a lot to say. And then, of course, they said consulting with older people, both to inform the government policy and to share tips, because actually they do need to know what they should be doing and how they should be changing some of their lifestyles, or making changes to how they're living. So those were the asks of the charities that are working both in the climate space and in the older people space and in general. Next slide, please. And then the next question that we asked, having had these great discussions around people's experiences of the nature crisis and the climate crisis, was to ask them, what would you like government to do? So they were particularly interested in policy relating to the following 3 things. First was transport, and about making the public transport infrastructure more accessible. We spoke to lots of people living right across the UK, in rural areas, in urban areas, all of them really concerned about the fact that there isn't enough public transport and the impact that has on people's lives and on the climate. The second issue was housing, and they were keen to see greater subsidies and more regulation, more subsidies for home improvements and making changes to people's homes, but also more regulation on new building developments. And there was a lot of concern about the way in which housing is being allowed to develop without really thinking about the impact on the climate and nature crisis, and making homes that would be suitable for the future. And then finally, the third area was around health and social care. And it's very clear that a lot of health and care settings are just not equipped for environmental impacts. They don't have the right cooling and heating. They don't have the locations that are accessible during flooding, for example. And so these things are having a big impact on people who are, the biggest users of health and, of course, of social care too. And so this was a very important area for the older people that we spoke with. So across these and broader policy areas, older people felt that government is insufficiently acknowledging the interdependencies of policy decisions. And the older people we spoke to, this was a month or 2 ago, felt that the government was definitely too short-term in its thinking. And now I think we hand over to Dan.
Thank you so much, Meryl. That was so informative, and it's great to hear older people's voices come through about what is needed. Dan, over to you to focus on disabled people.
Thank you, Basile. Thank you for chairing this today. Thank you, MPC, for the brilliant work, and thank you, Emma, who I have worked with on and off, and she's just an incredible driven person on climate change policy. And it's also sad to see Meryl leave today because it's been great working with her on this as well. But yeah, disabled people and climate change. We became aware that climate change will have a detrimental and sadly horrific impact on the lives of disabled people. Probably along with age, probably the most effective when it comes to the effects of climate change. We spoke to 63 people across 4 deliberation groups and discussed how climate impacts were impacting their ability to live the lives that they'd like. From this, disabled people told us that they wanted charities to support them in the following ways: help disabled people advocate for their rights, to support them, and also in relation to environmental impacts and government policy responses. It is absolutely essential that disabled people are given the tools to advocate for their own rights, because unfortunately we are living in a climate where so much is done for disabled people without actually talking to or engaging with disabled people. So we found that there was a perpetual frustration on that part. So self-advocacy is really important and was one of the prime things that disabled people wanted to see. Ensuring information on environmental crisis and policy responses are accessible. This was another one that was really found to be important, because historically, when policy responses are made, they are obviously excluding disabled people. Information on environmental crisis was something we found was predominantly negative as well. We saw a failure to consider all aspects of accessibility when it comes to writing policy or information, or even holding debates externally. There was a drop-off of no sign language interpretation, no accessible information or communication, and physical access to certain events, which are talking about these things as well, were often to be found excluding, with mobility. For people with mobility and sensory impairments, they were not able to join in. Also help disabled people to manage the impacts of the environmental crisis on their health and well-being, again giving the power back to the disabled community. There was a lot of frustration amongst the people that we actually spoke to, but a lot of positivity as well, a lot of engagement. Disabled people really want to be involved in this conversation because they can see the negative impacts, and they do deserve a voice to it. We had so many wonderful mixed disabilities amongst that group who all gave all these responses and are desperate for self-advocacy. Now, the next slide, please. So what disabled people want government to do? Disabled people see lots of co-benefits in environmental action, including policies that bring about well-insulated housing, learning to reduce energy use, reducing costs and emissions, as well as supporting temperature regulation for disabled people. We found historically that disabled people are living in households that are not fit for purpose, are not well insulated, and in fact, not altogether accessible for their needs. Regulation of public transport to ensure accessibility, such as keeping staff ticket offices, which is essential. If disabled people are going to use the train, they want to see actual physical people there to help them on and off the trains, regardless of their disability. They need that assistance there. But the most significant area where disabled people wanted better policy was in relation to household income. Disabled people wanted to see more subsidisement for environmental infrastructure, such as solar panels or electric vehicles, and acknowledgement that the costs can be higher for disabled people, both in heating and in electric vehicles, adapting vehicles, so forth, so forth. Improve benefits to protect disabled people from poverty. Allow disabled people to travel, whether it be public transport or privately, and ensure that they can cover the costs of disability in relation to climate impacts, such as air conditioning or refrigeration, hot weather. Disabled people are very susceptible to changes in climate and changes in temperature. Many disabled people cannot self-regulate their body temperature, so they need either a household to be warm constantly. So these things are vitally important and need to be talked about. There needs to be no imposing of taxes that harm disabled people, such as single-use plastics. the IUK are currently working with Greenpeace on the 2025 plastics treaty, in which we have now opened a door to them to say there are plastics, essential plastics, that must be exempt from any ban, and they cannot be subsidised by tax. There need to be exemptions for disabled people from some climate policies, such as ultra low emission zones or low traffic neighbourhoods. Disabled people need access to city centres. They need access to low traffic neighbourhoods because more than often than not, public transport is inaccessible. And the only way people can have active social engagement with the outside and get what they need is literally to drive to the shops. And Kush, I see Kush is here today, who is also doing fantastic work on the ULEZ and in Greater London and other areas. In support for household incomes, disabled people also wanted more accessible information about the environment through a centralised body. Like I said, all information needs to be completely accessible for all disabilities. This includes health advice, accessible research on climate impacts, easy read guidance, and accessible emergency planning resources. Sadly, disabled people are more than twice as likely to die in natural disasters. More inclusive ways for disabled people to have their voices heard on climate issues. Policymakers need to actively listen to disabled people, and disabled people should be proportionally represented within those policy-making decisions. Once again, nothing about us without us. We also want to be involved in designing and implementing design solutions and to be part of all debates on climate change. What works for a disabled person will universally work for everyone else. It just makes sense for us to be involved in designing and implementing these solutions. Altogether, disabled people felt that disabled people's organisations, that's DPOs, have a vital role to play in bringing disabled people together and working with government as equals. They should highlight existing ways for disabled people to get involved. This is not charity, it is basic human rights protection. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dan. I neglected to say that Dan is a Policy and Campaigns Officer at Disability Rights UK, but hopefully he's sufficiently famous for you all to know that. Well, I think Meryl and Dan have given us such a great overview of some of the findings. I know some of you will be wanting to read the findings in more detail, but the kind of things I took away from that, some of the commonalities, disabled and older people wanting more information both on the crises but also how they could respond to it in their own lives, that information needing to be accessible. Disabled and older people wanting to have a voice either through self-advocacy or campaigning so that they were at the table influencing change. Disabled people and older people wanting to actually take more control, so they weren't just bypassed and ignored in these discussions. So I think that's given us some amazing sort of commonality. And then the campaigning for government, the big areas, again, there was a lot of commonality I felt between what Meryl and Dan said around let's really do something about housing. Let's really do something about the built environment and transport. Let's tackle health and social care, and let's tackle subsidies for people on very low incomes who aren't going to be able to adjust in the same way as others with more money. So some really fantastic findings. And I probably should have said this earlier, and it probably goes without saying, but disabled and older people are going to be some of the groups that are hardest hit by how we live today, with unsuitable housing, with damp housing, with poor access to transport, with inadequate health and social care support. I think we've got so much to gain as communities from playing a part in this climate change movement. I'm going to hand over to Naomi now, because it's your chance to have some questions and comments, and Naomi's going to lead that for me. Thanks, Naomi.
Great, thank you, Fazile. So yeah, do keep any questions coming through on the chat, and I'll start with the ones that we have. So first to Emma, you talked about how people can take action locally rather than just nationally. Do you think there's a gap in the middle where those more kind of systemic national actions meet that local action? And if so, how do you think disabled people and disabled people's organisations could contribute to filling that gap?
Yes, I guess it's tricky in terms of so much of what happens on a local level is defined by that national level stuff, which I think certainly as a local campaigner can feel quite hard to change. And I think that's where kind of working as kind of DPOs or disabled people across different areas, I think is really important. I think certainly, for example, clean air zones is kind of one of those areas where like locally, you know, individual councils can decide how that's rolled out, but then they're kind of limited by the amount of money they have. And kind of certainly we found here there's a bit of a sort of clash between kind of asking for stuff and then them sort of slowly understanding the need to change it, but then also being limited by the money they had, and but also still limited by not caring quite enough. Yeah, I guess I haven't worked much in that area, so I don't feel like I have the full answers, but certainly there's something about working to solidarity across different areas to kind of help push upward from local to national level. And but I guess that's kind of in a sense what this report is doing in some ways, of kind of like talking to lots of disabled people from everywhere to make those kind of national changes.
Absolutely. Thank you. Kush, do you want to ask your question directly?
Well, thank you very much. Thank you for the name check as well, Dan. So I just wanted to give a bit of context about what's been happening in London with the ultra low emission zone that was implemented originally actually in October 2021 in the height of the pandemic. And there wasn't adequate reasonable adjustment for disabled people. So sometimes I think the debate kind of portrays it as like a binary choice, that either we have clean air or we have accessible environment. And it's totally untrue. Like, we can have both clean air and accessible environment. So what I kind of say is that climate action must go hand in hand with climate justice and social justice. Otherwise, all we'll do is actually just penalize those who have already been the most disproportionately impacted in a cost of living crisis, in a pandemic, and since austerity. So if you look at London, only 1/3 of London's tube stations are accessible with step-free access. And lots of disabled people have no choice but to drive in relation to accessing critical goods, services, primary care, secondary care. So to me, it's an issue of human rights. It's an issue of the Equality Act. It's an issue of reasonable adjustment. So I started the campaign in London like 2.5 years ago, and thank you to Disability Rights and Inclusion London for their support. But essentially what happened was, originally they only gave exemptions if the car was tax classified as disabled. But you can only classify your car as disabled driver or passenger if you receive the highest rates of benefits. So that's higher rate mobility PIP or DLA. But the issue was, in relation to standard rate mobility PIP, there was no reasonable adjustment. There was no reasonable adjustment in regards to blue badge holders. So we started a campaign, you know, we were featured in many media organizations. I was on TV. We had a vote at the London Assembly. Then we got support actually from the Transport Committee. And in January of this year, we managed to get further reasonable adjustments in London. So essentially what's happened in London now is they've given exemptions to standard rate mobility PIP, a number of DWP benefits. This helps over 250,000 disabled people in London. We've increased grants from £2,000 to £10,000 for this rapid scheme. And we've also got provisions now for carers, and we've extended the grace period to 2027. I'm currently the vice chair of the regional stakeholder network with the disability unit, and they've launched a consultation that runs until the 5th of October. In that consultation, if you look at question 4, there's climate adaptations and mitigations. So what I'm calling for now is actually a national policy to be created where we exempt all blue badge holders from all current and future clean air zones in England. So if you look at Scotland, Scotland has exempted blue badge holders. Currently, London, Bristol, Birmingham, there's no exemptions for blue badge holders. So what I'm requesting is people please submit, please put a response into this consultation. We have like until the 6th of October where we can create national policy that, you know, as well as climate action, we can have climate justice and social justice. So that's kind of my request. I put the relevant links in the chat. But please support this, because we have like just over a week left now where we can actually form national policy that will help Bristol, it will help Birmingham, it will help London and any future clean air zones.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much for sharing that example with us. I think it's a fantastic success that you've already had, and a great kind of immediate action that those of us here today can take to further this kind of ethos of the programme, is very much finding those win-wins, that policy that helps disabled people and older people can be environmental policy, and it's not a trade-off, as you say. So thank you for sharing that. Meryl, a question for you, if that's okay. So over the past week, the government has announced delays and the end to a number of environmental policies. And the narrative that's been around that has been that, you know, this is what the people want, and particularly low income groups. The deliberation groups that you've shared today don't seem to show that that's what people want. How can we on this call and more generally in the sector mobilise ourselves to respond to this?
Oh, love that question. Well, I think that what you guys started at MPC by bringing together these voices has been so important. And what's been really interesting being part of this project is that we've collectively spoken to people, not just older people and disabled people, but you've got different strands, haven't you, with the youth strand and the ethnic minority strand and so on. And there's huge commonalities there. So actually there's a lot of voices that are coming together via this project. And I think that capturing these voices has been absolutely critical, because yes, people are saying that they are hurt by the cost of living crisis, but they are absolutely not saying, so therefore please hurt the environment to keep things cheap. I don't think that any of these focus groups have brought that up, and there's been ample opportunity at the focus groups and in the consultations to say that if people wished to, but they haven't wanted to say that. And I think it's very important that we now capture all of these voices and say, well, you've got a cross-section of society here, you know, and plenty of people who can raise their voices, like industry, which has been an interesting one for us all this week, hasn't it? And politicians and so on are raising their voices on this one. But this is a huge collective raising of voices, and I think that the work that you've done pulling together these varied groups of people to demonstrate the impact that this is having on individuals, and also that there's another element within this, which was it. So one of the interesting things that's come out of the wide range of the research is also the sort of very, very individual impacts. And we are all, I think, aware of young people feeling that their mental health is being really affected by the climate crisis. And we know that there's huge amounts of climate anxiety amongst younger people. And that actually, that's just exacerbating something that's already been was a problem, and then was a huge problem because of the pandemic, and is now an even bigger problem. And so that's one thing. And then in Re-engage, we're an organization focused on loneliness and the impact of climate change and the nature crisis on loneliness, and the inability for people to get out and about, and the knock-on effect of having a better public transport infrastructure and accessibility that would be for the mental well-being and the loneliness and the community, the opportunity to create community. That's all interlinked. Now, the problem with that is you've got to have a focus. And actually the focus for today is people don't want us to be watered down. There was nobody in any of our groups said, actually we can't afford this because of the cost of living crisis. They're saying we must get on with this. We can't afford not to do this. So I think raise those voices, you know, work together. And this whole project has been a bringing together of a huge variety of people who've got so much to offer and so many different perspectives, and we should really make use of that.
Fantastic.
Does that answer the question?
Yes, I think so. Thank you so much, Meryl.
Naomi, I think we've got time for just one more question and then we should move on.
Great, thank you for keeping me to time, Fazile. I just wanted to briefly pick up on Ben's question in the chat around kind of public transport and mobility aids being not permitted on public transport, and then the kind of what seems to be enormous spread of kind of cycle and e-scooter hire schemes that aren't accessible for disabled people. This is something that came up in the deliberation groups, Ben, and there was a kind of desire for some of the financial incentives that are in place at a national level to encourage this innovation to be balanced with regulation that means that it's actually useful that you know, new e-scooter schemes are accessible for those who need to use them and don't reduce accessibility of the built environment, and then also that, you know, that those linkages between systems, so the being able to use mobility aids on public transport, for example, carry through. I will just leave that question, I think, because it's more for the group itself about, has anyone else done any work on this? Ben works for Wheels for Wellbeing, which is really specialist in the space. But if you want to go and share any insight you have in the chat, that would be fantastic. And then, sorry, Fazile, I'm abusing my powers, but
You're going to disobey me.
I'll ask one last question to Dan this time. So we've heard that the deliberation group said that older people and disabled people want social charities to help them advocate. It feels like so far most environmental advocacy has come from kind of who we think of as environmental charities. You mentioned Greenpeace in your presentation. Do you think we need to get better representation in those organisations of older people and disabled people, or do you think that the kind of charities that more traditionally represent and work with older people and disabled people should be doing more direct advocacy themselves?
It's actually both scenarios, actually. The work we're doing with Greenpeace and with Extinction Rebellion, well, that they both come to the firm opinion that they need to have disabled people working with the organisations, both organisations. And it was very refreshing to hear from the outset when we first started engaging with them on this process, disability climate change, how honest they were with the fact they didn't have anyone disabled within both organisations. So now we're collectively working with them, myself and my CEO Cameron, working with them over the next few weeks to hopefully put someone in place that can liaise between both organisations and us as a disabled people's organisation ourselves in order to further and grow the work. Both organisations have been incredibly receptive to the idea. In fact, like I said, working with us on a plastics treaty, we're working with Extinction Rebellion on next year's heat strike events, all police liaised, by the way, just to put that out there, because now Extinction Rebellion have changed their remit from mostly activism to engaging with police and government on what they're going to do. So we're working with both of them on that, but also it does come down to DPO groups and charities to push from the other side as well. We're seeing such an incredible interest since we started this work, myself, Cameron and Fazile and MPC as well, and Meryl and everyone, since we've all started this work collectively together, we're seeing an interest from other groups when they find out we're working on disability and climate change, because the existing reports out in the world about the actual detrimental effects on disabled people are just phenomenal, and they keep rolling into my inbox. I mean, even the United Nations has said that disabled people are going to be the hardest hit by a changing climate. So the conversation is there, but people are also seeing a correlation between climate change and cost of living. The two are actually entwined with each other. So one conversation sparks off another, and people are getting very, very interested now. So it is really a duality. We have the climate groups are now starting to see this as an issue and pushing for it, and disabled people's organisations and disabled charities are starting to see things. So the volume is growing, and we're joining the networks between the two. So it will become bigger and bigger. But obviously, we'd love more people here to be involved, not only with the disabled, but with Meryl and Re-Engage as well, and what they're doing, because it is all such fantastic work. So the more collaboration we have, the more networks we have, the louder the voices we get, the more we get a chance to enact that policy and get in to make those changes.
Great, thank you so much, Dan. And Naomi, thank you for that session. That was really interesting questions being asked. Can I thank again Emma and Meryl and Dan, because I think you've all given us such food for thought, and it's kind of a really nice roundup of the work that NPC's been doing over the past year. But we're now going to move into kind of the last third of the meeting, which is about getting our audience here today to do some thinking about what the next year should look like. You know, what do they want to see? What tools do you need? What should NPC be doing to really support organisations take this agenda forward? And Naomi's going to introduce a kind of tool for you to use, and then we're going to have some facilitated discussion with another NPC colleague. But Naomi, over to you.
Great. Thank you, Fazile. I put a link in the chat, or there's a code on the screen if you go to menti.com and want to type in 23633227. That will bring up an online tool. There are 3 multiple choice questions. That's just for us to understand kind of the temperature of the room in terms of wanting to take action, the amount of action that you're currently taking in this space. We've heard some quite challenging, bold calls to action from our speakers today. So we're really keen to understand the kind of appetite to do that. But also we understand that it's a challenging context for all charities at the moment. So it'd be really good to understand the barriers that you face to doing more work in this space, whether you're a social charity that doesn't normally do work in the climate space, or an environmental organisation that doesn't normally kind of have this social emphasis. And then also the support that NPC might provide through the Everyone's Environment programme over the next year to help you overcome some of those barriers. If for whatever reason Menti isn't accessible to you, then do feel free to put your thoughts on those questions in the chat, or my colleague Liz will be facilitating a conversation, so you're welcome to contribute verbally as well. I'll just give everyone a few minutes to kind of input their thoughts. I can see people successfully getting there and the answers are ticking up, so that's always a relief. But do keep them coming.
Thank you all so much for completing the questions. How are we doing, Naomi? Are we getting them ticking up still?
I'll just give everyone a couple more minutes just to allow, because I know the written answers take a little bit longer to have a think about.
It's great. It's a great exercise.
This will stay open until the end of today's event. So if you do want a bit more time to think and to submit later, then that's also absolutely fine. I'll just give it one more minute.
Yeah.
Great. Liz, I'll share my screen and hand over to you.
Wonderful, thank you. Hello all, I'm Liz. So let's have a look at what we've got in the room. So there's a real range of understanding on what the how aware you are of how to embed a response to the social impacts of the environmental crises into your work. It's really reflective of where everybody is right now. We're all on a learning journey together, and we'll make sure we share in the chat some of the learning we've had previously to the findings out this week, including some desk research, which may help you more. And we will talk about how we continue to do this together. Lots of openness though, that's great. Lots considerably, perhaps those who are on the sort of not so sure level might be for reasons to do with capacity and funding. We can explore that together. But no one who's saying they're not open at all to taking action. So that's lovely to see. We do the next one, Naomi. And the extent that everybody is already trying to do something. Well, isn't that fabulous? Everyone's on the journey to various extents. And most of us are sort of in the middle there, and moderately working towards doing quite a bit. A small number of us feeling like we've been pushing down that line some way now. So plenty to learn from amongst each other in the group. And then in the free text, let's have a look at barriers. There's a lot here about systemic barriers, structural barriers, funding and knowledge coming up plenty, CEOs stuck in their ways. We've heard that with other groups, although not a universal problem, and needing to get senior folks on board. It's quite a bit around sort of the basics of reasonable adjustments, engaging those outside traditional audiences, cost of engagement, yes. So again, sort of funding barriers, core to your work, wonderful. Funding capacity, resourcing capacity, encouraging people to speak open and honestly, yes. Attitudinal barriers, lots of learning there. We will digest this fully, but it gives us a flavour of where we all are in the room. And in terms of support, educating through examples, sharing information, wider understanding of the intersectional issues, policy changes, more accessibility of information, encouraging internal leadership, capacity and funding, networking and learning from each other, events like this, lovely. More long-term funding, yes. So some very clear and shared barriers and solutions there. It would be great to unpack that a little more in discussion. Thank you, Naomi. So in terms of this last session, I'd really encourage you to feel able to share your needs, your experiences, your suggestions. We're all learning together. And as a part of the group involved in the Everyone's Environment programme at MPC, we speak to a lot of charities, and we find that almost all are at the beginning or even the middle of the journey. Nobody has all of the answers. And in fact, the fact that you're here today shows that you are one of the organisations who is actively engaging and ahead of others in the sector. So please don't feel shy to share where you've got concerns. We particularly want to hear from you today about the barriers you're facing and the things that might help you to help us, alongside similar discussions in other webinars in this series, understand better together where we are as a sector, how we can increasingly take action on the social impacts of the environmental crises, and where we might have shared issues that we can work upon together. So please use the chat liberally, raise your hand if you'd like to hear a thought, share a thought. And what I'd really love to hear from you now is either if you've got reflections from what you've heard today on how this will affect your work, or anything you'd like to build on from what we just saw in the Menti around barriers and things that would help you. Is anyone brave enough to kick off our conversation for us? Reflections on today, barriers and possible solutions. Would anybody like, Meryl, is that your hand up? Go for it, Meryl.
Yes, I thought I'd jump in here. I think that what we need to, we've had some really amazing conversations with lots of organisations, and we found all sorts of areas of interest and commonality. in the end, we're an organisation that works on tackling loneliness, and we have to make sure that that's what we're continuing to do. So I think that there's with it right we've you've created the strand, and I think that's been an incredibly powerful way of doing this. The next bit is to figure out how it's that sort of intersectional, cross-sectional weaving together of all the different themes that emerge, so that we can all continue to work to use our energies and our expertise as best as possible, because we can agree on lots of things, but then turning that into action is going to be difficult if we don't find the right areas of focus that suit particular people. So I'm really interested in the transport issue, for example, and I know there'll be lots of people, but there'll be other people who are just like, what, that's not something we're interested in. So I think something about creating areas of focus that, and then really bringing our expertise to those is going to be really important. Otherwise Dan and I could spend days just nodding, but see, we're doing it now, but actually we are going to have to move on to the next phase, which means that he and I might not be working on exactly the same things, but we need to be confident that we're working on the right things.
Thank you, Meryl. Absolutely. Some of the things we saw in the Menti findings there around barriers, capacity, funding, collaborating takes both of those, doesn't it? What would be your calls to action for funders in terms of the type of support that would be most helpful for further funding? Anybody got any examples of where some additional funding or unrestricted funding has helped them? Jess?
Hiya. Not necessarily of where it's helped us, but I've been doing a lot of research in the last year about how we, as an organisation, so we are part of the Royal Society of Wildlife Trust, but we're a Buckinghamshire, Oxfordshire and Berkshire Wildlife Trust, and how we can work much better with people with disabilities and with elderly people. And we've started something called lifelong learning, which I know some of the other trusts have done as well, which is education and courses based on the environment, but also people's well-being that are specifically for older people or for adults. And I come from a long history of working with disabled people and people with different neurodiversities in my previous role for a national organisation, but a much smaller organisation than the one that I'm currently in. And the biggest issue that I find is every pot of possible funding or interesting funding that comes up for engaging different types of communities within this sort of sphere is all for smaller turnover organisations, which is absolutely needed and absolutely warranted, but it does then limit us in what we're able to go for, because obviously part of our organisation is teaching people about the environment and nature and all of that, but the other half of it obviously is land management in ecology, environmental sustainability and upkeep of our lands. And it really then does divide us as to what trusts we can apply for, what organisations offering that funding, and what then that priority of that funding becomes, whether it is something that we can channel then back into our education and working with communities, or it's something that goes towards more of like upkeep and sustainability of land. And if there were more opportunities or other opportunities for us to be able to tap into some of those smaller pots of money, we could really work and pilot some of these really great opportunities that we'd love to be involved in and that we would really like to do, but otherwise we just aren't able to afford them.
Very insightful, Jess. Yes, and perhaps another of the areas in which we might collaborate and work together more, as sort of Meryl and Dan kicked us off with, one of the other areas that we have had mentioned before in this space is perhaps it would be helpful to have some mechanisms to better allow organisations to identify who else is working on similar issues and to make those connections to support potential collaborations, whether that's sort of peer networks or something of that nature. Is there an appetite in the room for that type of linking up? Seeing some thumbs up, yeah.
Do you mind if I jump in on that, Liz?
Lucy, go.
That's really, really interesting, especially as someone that considers myself really aligned with all of the principles and conversations that have happened today, but in a completely different field. And so to find partners and to find people that are excited about it, to collaborate with a theatre maker, presenting these stories and these attitudes and opinions directly from older adults, material development, using resources as part to instigate those conversations and then create theatre from it, would be a really, what you've just described as a mechanism to know who would be interested in that and who I could approach that would you know, without just kind of like firing darts in the dark, would be really, really helpful to me especially. And it's already been really encouraging today, not just to hear the conversations that I'm excited and alive to, but to understand that there is an appetite, even just through the chat, to be like, oh yeah, this is great, we can talk about that. So for me, that is really super interesting, a kind of cohesion between different industries with the same vision and interests.
Thank you so much, Lucy, and the others who gave a thumbs up or noted in the chat. Together we are stronger than we are separately and can create a greater impact. Another of the things that I saw in the Menti, which has come up in other conversations as well, is variations in how much senior leaders or trustees are bought in and actively encouraging work on the social impacts of the environmental crises. And of course, we have very senior people in the room amongst us as well, but for those who are perhaps looking to encourage more engagement within their organisations or their boards, what kind of support would help you there? Is that perhaps toolkits, information, linking with other people to share ideas? What kinds of things would help you?
Excuse me for jumping in, but I think info share is obviously the top priority here. And as we proved through the brilliant work that we've done with MPC, thank you, that the info is there within the MPC group and all the different strands and structures. It's there within no doubt within the different strands as well, individually as charities and ourselves as DPOs. The information is there. We have, myself, I have a huge PDF file full of reports from the UN, reports from other governments around the world, reports from charities globally about the detrimental effects of climate change upon disabled people. So the information is there amongst all these strands. The information, I think, is cohesively getting it all together into one big area where people can dip in to it and use it as they need to. Because once people are presented with facts, and the simple fact is the climate is changing, the simple fact is it's going to disproportionately affect more people than most. So it's very much of a vested interest, I think, for all other organisations and groups to be into this, because it is a hot topic. It's not going away, and we're seeing reports daily come in. So I think for trustees themselves, I think very, very many of them are probably attuned to it, also a bit wary of going into it from a political aspect. But obviously, it is everything we do has a political aspect to it at the end of the day. That's why we're in the jobs that we're in. So I think, as someone's just put in the chat, there's stakeholder mapping. That's a good idea. But also, like I said, the information is there. People, and info share is a good thing. We have information we're willing to share, because obviously cooperation is key just to get this situation up and rising and to implement ourselves within various political groups and organizations. So yeah, I think information sharing is key. And I think trustees, once they learn about the issue and are more versed into the issue, that they will want to discuss it. Because like I said, in the work I'm doing, I'm finding more and more people now are going, oh, that's what you're working on, tell me more, how can we help, what can we do to amplify it? So yeah, there is a thirst for it. I think trustees need to be made aware of that thirst, and then I think it'd just be an easy sell for people.
That's really helpful, Dan. There's a lot in there. So there's something about continuing to keep up to date, info sharing as the field and understanding evolves. There's also about the people who need to see that information and a sense that once they've seen it, they'll buy in. Emma was saying in the chat that better understanding is needed amongst trustees. I wonder if Emma or anybody else wanted to build on that and say, you know, what are the best routes to get to trustees? Is it simply a case of putting the facts in front of them? Is more needed? What might that support look like?
I'm not really sure what to say to this. I feel like I've seen all the problems, but not the solutions. But yes, just a need for, particularly amongst DPO trustees, to understand that this, you know, climate work is disability work, and it's not a matter of you're letting go of one if you're doing the other. I guess kind of more conversation in those communities, so it just feels like they don't feel like some kind of weird pressure to block this work because they think it would stop us doing disability work.
Yeah. Just very briefly on the mapping, I'm not able to share links with you today, but I'm aware of 2 organisations who are working on some mapping. One is the work that the Countryside Links is doing, which has already been mentioned, and there's another online searchable database under development separate to MPC. So we will hopefully be able to share that information once that launches. And then more widely, one of the things that's come up in conversations with other groups, which sometimes relates to the trustee issue, is that it might be helpful to have some how-to guides, some practical tools and support to help you perhaps developing your strategies or your advocacy and your policy influencing or engagement work, although I know in your space there's a lot of expertise in that area already. Are there any practical tools, supports, how-to guides that would be welcomed? Maybe to have a ponder about that and let me know. Saskia, coming back to the question of funding, did you want to jump in and share that thought? We're good. She's offered her email address in the chat. Oh, bless you, your mic's not working. Have a look in the chat. She's open to conversations. We've just got a few minutes more to discuss. Is there anything that we've not spoken about today? There we go. Sorry, Charmaine.
No, I just noticed something in the Menti responses about older people being seen, I think, as actors and examples of that, older people and disabled people, of course. And I'm from Extinction Rebellion, grandparents and elders. We do a lot of actions which aim to highlight the effect of the climate crisis. So we've been outside the Department for Business and Industry when it was called that and so forth, showing older people being covered in oil, you know, that kind of thing. But I also put an example in the chat of having a protest at our local station where we all lined up on the platform and all needed access to the train at the same time. So this kind of thing is going on. Also the rocking chair rebellion in the United States, where elders sat in rocking chairs at a major intersection outside Chase Manhattan Bank. You know, there are very direct actions that older people are taking to show that we do care and we are very strong actors. And in fact, most environmental activists, and a high proportion of them are older people. So I just wanted to throw that in and encourage all your organizations to use, you know, performance on the street or whatever it is you can. As we know today, there's this huge rally for Restore Nature Now outside DEFRA, and a lot of green organizations are there, and hopefully older people's and disability organizations are there too. So we need to be seen, we need to be on the street as well as everything else we're doing. Thank you.
Thank you, Charmaine. I'd love to talk to you offline to capture some of those examples. And also what you say about the engagement of people who are now getting further advanced in the years of their life. Absolutely true. And many of those individuals were indeed activists earlier in their lives. When you think about things like Silent Spring and how many people who would now fall into that category of slightly older, who began the environmental movement back in the day. So a very, very important point to make. Thank you. We've also had a couple of things come in the chat whilst we've been talking. There's a bit of a theme perhaps around helping to have conversations with those who aren't convinced, regardless of what level they might be in the organisation. So that's an interesting thought for us to take away. Thank you very much, Kate, for that. And people sort of being slightly mind-boggled at those who aren't seeing the connection. Lee, you saying how people are the environment. Yes, we often think of ourselves as quite separate when actually our entire lives, existence, our food, our health, everything is intertwined. Any final reflections today from what you've heard from the speakers, perhaps the things you're going to take away from today's discussion and do, or the final thoughts you'd like to seed with us as we begin thinking about the responses we can give to your calls for action and support today? Lovely. Well, I know a lot of connections have been made today in the chat, so it's wonderful that so many of you are all going to be off to speak to each other or us behind the scenes. I shall pop my email in the chat again, and if you'd like to continue the discussion or get more involved in the Everyone's Environment programme, please do let me know. And I shall hand back for our closing comments, please.
Thank you, Liz. Thank you. That was really insightful discussion. Thank you, everyone. I know people have had to leave, and but I think a lot of people said what a good session it's been. So I just want to make a few closing remarks. Thank you for all your insights, particularly thank you to NPC and the funders, City Bridge Foundation and William Grant Foundation, for making this Everyone's Environment project possible. Thank you to our speakers, Emma McGean and Meryl Davis and Dan Pescod. Thank you to Naomi and Liz for helping us get through the conversations and the questions. So I think what's next is, as Naomi and Liz, they're about to start another year of this project, and they're going to use today's discussion to really shape what comes next. So please keep in touch with NPC and how the work is going to develop over the next year. There's been some great contributions. I mean, I think NPC will be spoilt for choice in what it can do, whether that's feeding back the voices of people facing inequalities to government, to local government, to international forums, whether it's giving us the tools as organisations to talk about climate change in more everyday terms, so it doesn't feel kind of something remote from people. And the crossovers, Emma's made the point, the crossovers with housing, with transport, with the environment. We can call it climate change, but if we need to talk about it in different ways, let's do that. I really love the idea of not only upskilling ourselves and raising our own voices as organisations representing disabled people, older people, other protected characteristics, but actually getting some of the big traditional organisations already involved in nature conservation or climate change, or to actually, get them start thinking about it, not just in terms of extra funding, but in terms of shaping their strategic priorities. and embedding our voices in their work. So there's so much potential, and I think we got the sense from Meryl and Dan that disabled people and older people want to be part of the story and want to shape our future. So keep feeding back your thoughts to NPC as they shape the next year's work. I know there's already plans to run more workshops, and I think trustees are on the list for that as well. So picking up some of the issues people mentioned around governance. So I hope you all found this a really, really useful session. Naomi, is there any final comment you'd like to make?
Sorry, no, you've perfectly covered everything for Zile. That's great. Thank you so much, everyone.
Yeah, thank you so much for your time, and keep in touch with NPC and stay together on this journey. We will make a difference, I promise. Bye, everyone.
Thank you all.
Bye, thank you.
Bye, thank you.